would the Minister for Environment, Food and Agriculture tell us how many buildings have been entered onto the Protected Buildings Register since October 2016? How many buildings have been removed from the register and on what grounds? And whether his department is properly protecting the historic built environment? Thank you, Mr. President.
To reply.
Thank you, Mr. President. I can advise that 27 buildings have been considered for registration in 2016, of which 17 have been registered and 10 have been considered and not registered. In addition, we are working through an initial review of other buildings that have been proposed. One has been removed from the register, but an appeal has been made in respect of this, so it will not be appropriate to go into the reasons why in this call. The question asks whether my department is properly protecting the historic environment. I would say that we are, and that reasonable progress is being made, but we could do better. Unfortunately, the momentum that we built up has been somewhat undermined by staffing and recruitment, but we are working to address this. We have also reviewed policy and procedures and published an operational policy on principles of selection. We have, of course, been delivering on the reform of planning action, of the planning action plan and amendments to building regulations responsible to the need to be more energy efficient, and officers have been seconded to the climate change team. I believe the approach is the right one, and with staffing issues resolved, I hope in the near future we will be able to continue progress demonstrated earlier.
Supplementary question, Mrs. Maska.
Thank you, Mr. President. Would the Minister agree that under the programme for government there is an obligation on his department to carry out an audit of the historic built environment, and that I was heartened to see that is included again in the statements in the budget. I'm wondering if you could enlighten us as to when that audit might start, which is part of protecting our historic built environment. Thank you, Mr. President.
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. President. Yes, we do have programme for government commitments. Unfortunately, as I explained, we have been having staffing resource issues. And of course, when that programme for government was drawn up, the climate change situation was completely different. And a lot of our department resource has been deployed in helping with the action plan and various other things. It is my intention to progress that audit, but I can't make any firm promises at the moment because it is resource dependent. It would be useful if we can engage with Building Conservation Forum, Culture Banning or MNH to progress that through third parties, and we may look at maybe funding or aiding with assistance in that if we are approached or there is an appetite to do it.
Honourable Member for Middle, Mr. Shimmons.
Thank you, Mr. President. Is the Minister aware that 2 important town centre developments have been postponed in the last 12 months as a result of last-minute registration? One could bring 200 much-needed jobs to Ramsey. Another on the quay in Douglas is now an empty building which is deteriorating, blighting this area. Will his department consider the importance of town centre regeneration when considering these matters? Ultimately, do we want lots of empty, dilapidated buildings or vibrant towns?
Yeah. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. President. Rock and a hard place come to mind in answering this. We get more call from one side to register buildings and save them, and from the other, they're impeding development and redevelopment and economic development. I won't comment specifically on the buildings in question, but we have to be careful that we don't encourage people to let buildings deteriorate to a point where there is political pressure or pressure from the community to demolish buildings that are worthy of conservation. So it's a game, not a game, it's something we have to play with very carefully. And we are aware, obviously, of both sides of the argument within the department, particularly in the planning department, and it is a difficult conundrum.
Honourable Member for Ramsey, Mr. Hooper.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I may have missed this comment, but is the Minister able to tell us how many buildings are on this provisional list that the Honourable Member of the Council mentioned earlier? He's mentioned that he published a selection policy and how the registration process works. Would he consider publishing this provisional list as well? It that might help avoid the sort of farcical situation that we see, for example, in Ramsey, where you have a building that is registered by the Minister, then deregistered by the Minister very quickly afterwards, and then you have appeals being fought back and forth, all to added cost and no real benefit. I think publishing that provisional list would at least give people all the information that they need.
Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Well, I think publishing the provisional list would be a retrograde step, as this would alert building owners of the fact that their building may be potentially registered in the future, and that may lead to activity alteration that would perhaps not desirable under the circumstances.
Honourable Member for Douglas South, Ms Castaigne.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm wondering if the Minister can comment on respect of the audit that's been referred to that hasn't yet been started and that there's no date yet for it to be started. Could he confirm whether that is going to be on the Chief Minister's list of successes and failures under slippage or failure?
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the moment, it's a slippage. It is not a failure.
Honourable Member Mr Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. President. Does the Minister agree with me that the strategic plan is full of policies to encourage regeneration, to encourage new development in existing settlements, which is in line with the particular character and identity of the existing settlements? That's basically a presumption of the strategic plan. And also, would the Minister agree with me that he would encourage creative reuse of these older buildings to make sure that they continue in use rather than preserving them in aspic?
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. President. Yes, I think the strategic plan and also the planning officers are very aware that buildings need to have a useful use, and creative reuse in a commercial sense secures a building's future. Just setting an aspect is a bad way of preserving a building, because if there's no commercial use or residential use for buildings, then they will, unless people are very wealthy or they are monuments of some sort that are maintained by government, they will fall into disrepair, and that's what we don't want to see in town centres and around our island.
Now I have a growing list of supplementary questions which will be admirably suited for a debate. We're not going to have a debate, so there must be short questions and short answers. Please, Mrs Maska.
Thank you, Mr. President. Would the Minister agree that once his registered buildings officers are in place, one of the fundamental approaches to conservation is where a building has lost its original use, a reuse being identified can really help generate good design, even on a site which is due for redevelopment, and that can add to the richness of our towns and settlements.
Yeah.
Mr. President.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. President. Yes, the registered building officers are able to advise on reuse of buildings, but at the end of the day, it is down to the owners of those buildings to come up with schemes that we can advise on for their useful reuse.
Ms Castaigne, further supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will be brief. At what point does the Minister consider that the slippage, as far as the audit is concerned, would be a failure?
Thank you, Mr. President. It will be a failure if at the end of this administration we have not completed it.
Mr Shimmons.
Thank you, Mr. President. Will the Minister agree with me that converting many very old buildings to modern standards, particularly for climate change, is simply commercially unviable? And unfortunately, the end result is that many registered buildings will continue to blot the urban landscape on this island as a result.
Yeah,
Invitation to express an opinion.
And that is the Honourable Questioner's opinion. I think there are different views on that, and older buildings, despite increased building regulations, restrictions or requirements, do not necessarily present as being unconvertible, unreusable.
Supplementary, Mr Hooper.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I appreciate the Minister's comments about publishing the list giving perhaps too much notice. But does he agree that when people are looking to purchase some of these buildings, actually whether the building is possibly going to be registered is quite an important commercial consideration, and the fact that they don't have this information until after the fact actually ends up paralysing development in our town centres, which then leaves us with derelict and vacant properties?
Paralysing.
Reply, sir.
Thank you, Mr. President. I think the characteristics of buildings that are potentially registerable are self-evident, and our planning department is very open to approaches. If a potential developer or owner came to the department, I'm sure they would be advised with potential for the building to be registered in the near future, or what alterations would trigger that.